Thank you very much for that. I think that was very informative. I'd like to turn on, I think John has some brief comments in reply, but also, John, if you could get into a little bit of what's going on with some of the, I won't call them the more minor provisions of the MMPR, but some of the other challenges other than just straight access. So being the limit to dried marijuana only, which obviously ignores the medical benefits of all the extracts that patients can produce. And also if you could get to, I think because we've done that once, there's a reasonable basis to think that the dried limit will be struck. But if your opinion would be that patients would be left to produce their own from the dried marijuana they get from a producer, let's say, or if that's something that the producers may be allowed to make and sell to the patients.
Well, I think the first thing that we have to note is that no licensed producer is going to be able to produce as cheaply as most of the folks who are producing for themselves. They tell me that's 50 cents to $3 a gram. And they are not part of the target market of the licensed producer. The licensed producers want to sell to people who can afford $3 and up, and $3 is the special price. Most of the prices are $5 and up. And I would expect that the majority of Canadians will be purchasing from licensed producers. But there's a very large number of Canadians who have learned how to grow for themselves, who put money into the production sites and have been able to do it for 50 cents to $3 a gram, and can do it, and it works for them, and so they shouldn't be forced to have to buy from someone else. But at the same time, as I said, our action is about preserving that for people. It's great that Peace Naturals has come up with a program for $3, and I think one of the others has come up with a program as well. But let's not forget, there are literally thousands of Canadians out there who can't afford their pharmaceuticals and who have drug plans that don't cover all of the money that it costs for their pharmaceuticals, and many of them are not going or using their pharmaceuticals and are plugging up emergency health care and things like that. So there's a major problem in terms of prescription drugs as well, but those people can't make their drugs. Here, you can make your drug. It's really a natural health care product, and that's where it'll go. If we get legalization, it's Food and Drug Natural Health Care Product regs that are going to cover this. So the dried marijuana thing, Kirk is here somewhere, Kirk Tusaw. He was counsel in Smith, in which the BC Supreme Court ruled, as in all of the other medical marijuana challenges, or pretty well all of them, that these limitations were too restrictive on the ambit and scope of the right. And so the court struck the word dried out of the regulations. But because it's a BC case, it's only applicable in BC. It's not binding on the rest of the country, and the government particularly seems to look at it this way. Now, it's been heard in our Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal's reserved judgments are waiting for a decision. The feds have recently confirmed to Kirk that the Allard injunction, which preserves the provisions of the MMAR as they relate to your license to possess, your authorization to possess, or your personal production, still protect people in British Columbia in terms of use of edibles. So people in BC can continue to use other than dried marijuana. Elsewhere they still can't, and the government in the MMPR is once again reintroducing a limit that a court has struck down, which in the cases Alan talked about earlier, there were all situations where efforts were being made to expand the program so people could grow for more than one. Government's response, you can grow for 2. Have more than 3 licenses in one place, court said too restrictive, government said you can grow for 4. So we've been used to this, cynical response from government now for some period of time. The extracts thing is a very important issue. It's a common issue, obviously, with the licensed producers. Ultimately, extracts is going to probably be the way that people get their medicine. And licensed producers want to be able to do that, and so they should be supporting the Allard case on that aspect in order to ensure that the courts rule that is too restrictive. Now, I think in Smith didn't cover juicing because juicing hadn't caught on as much, Kirk. The only other thing to tell you is that in the cross-examinations of the police, in the evidence that they're trying to put forward in Allard, the only thing that they really raised in terms of extract was the butane extraction issue in terms of safety, because they obviously know that you can make all these extracts without creating any safety problem for anybody, apart from the butane one, where there obviously has to be some safety precautions and regulations. I don't know if I've answered all the questions here.
Thank you, John. You brought up the issue of compassion clubs. Compassion clubs and dispensaries have obviously played a very important role in how Canadians have had access and also had knowledge and been able to gain knowledge about medical marijuana. Also, I understand that many of them offer ancillary services such as consulting and patient therapies, and then non-cannabis therapies at some clubs and dispensaries as well. Rielle, could you fill us in a little bit about what the clubs are doing, and also what you anticipate the role will be or will not be for compassion clubs as the laws move forward?
Yeah, so in Canada there's about 50 or so dispensaries and serving about 40,000 patients. The first one opened its door in British Columbia and Vancouver in 1997. And dispensaries were never part of the legal regulatory framework, so they've always been operating in what we've called a legal gray zone. Just the gray zone is because, they're not technically legal, although John was saying that there was a Section 53 that kind of there was a requirement for patients to have documentation from their healthcare provider saying that they had certain medical conditions and the use of cannabis was recommended. So that was the protection, really. And in courts, whenever dispensaries ended up in courts, they were upheld. Their work was upheld because they were fulfilling a gap. They were filling a gap that wasn't provided by the government, and they were being quite diligent about these documentations from providers. Any dispensary that wasn't being that diligent maybe didn't fare as well. But they never were part of the legal regulatory framework. They've been tolerated by their communities and upheld in court. There was the Canadian Association of Medical Cannabis Dispensaries formed right before the new regulatory changes were announced, in a kind of in a consultation phase. And there was a feeling that dispensaries maybe now would be the opportunity for dispensaries to be included in the legal regulatory framework, because it was being opened up to not just having one contracted provider, but many. And there was a few things in the regulations as they were proposed that seemed to negate dispensaries being able to be involved. In terms of having a storefront, that wasn't allowed, for example. But what dispensaries do have, and what is important to them, and that kind of we're seeing as some gaps in the proposed regulations and now the real regulations, is not having a storefront. So dispensaries have been able to provide access to cannabis for people to be able to come in and get whatever quantities they wanted in a very timely manner. And they were able to inspect visually and olfactory. They were able to smell what they were getting and see what they were getting before they would get it. They were also, again, be able to get really small amounts if needed, and there weren't shipping costs. The products that were available involved many different varieties of strains, as well as different products, edibles and extracts, tinctures and such. And as John mentioned, in British Columbia, that's now legal, but there's no legal source of that. Dispensaries also provided ID cards, which were in well-established dispensaries recognized by law enforcement in their communities. And they also were able to provide individualized plans, so when patients came in, they could do an intake session and see what the patients need, and they could monitor their use over time. Education was a really important tenet of dispensaries, so teaching cannabis users, people have been using it for a long time or never use it, how to use it most safely and effectively, how to find the strains that might work best for them, and to monitor themselves and have some autonomy over what they're using and how they're using it. There's also referrals to social services and health services. As Mark mentioned, some of them provided these other healthcare services, natural healthcare services. And there's also a social component, which was very important in terms of social capital and having connectedness and community. all of these things are also been shown to impact health as well as just the medicine itself. So what's been shown in studies as well, in the CAMP study, for example, that when people were rating all their different sources, dispensaries were found to be the highest rated for quality of products, the effectiveness, efficiency, safety, availability, the respect they felt, and social support. It was not rated the highest in terms of cost, but on all these other elements it was rated the highest. Under the MMER, or under the MMPR now coming along, that's really affected dispensaries trying to figure out what they're going to do and where they fit in. So it's different across the country is what we found. So in British Columbia, there's just more of a tolerance. Maybe that's because where they started. We also have some municipal governments that are making declarations of supporting dispensaries, but more and more dispensaries are opening up actually in Vancouver and out west now. We're not seeing that happen in Ontario and Quebec. We're seeing them either close or try to morph into either becoming a licensed producer or performing some supporting role, either in terms of doing the education or connecting patients with licensed producers. That ultimately affects patients, and I think that's what we always have to look at, and I was just starting to do interviews for the Canary study, and I spoke to one gentleman who was saying that he was formerly getting from a dispensary and was very happy with that. He lived out in the north, kind of a bit remote, and he came in once. He had to fly in to Toronto to connect with a dispensary, but once he did that, they were able to mail it to him. The price was good, the products were good, he was very happy. This dispensary decided to shut down to pursue becoming a licensed producer, and he was really left out in the cold. So he was now trying to find people to purchase from in his community. The prices were really prohibitive for him, and one thing that I was happily able to share with him is that there are other dispensaries that still have their doors open and that are doing mail-out services. He didn't know this, so the dispensary that shut down hadn't set him up with a new dispensary, and also they wanted to support him to become part of a licensed producer, be purchasing, but he wasn't able to find a doctor, and definitely not a doctor in where he lived, so he was quite hooped. So there a lot of dispensaries feel that there's still a role for them under the MMPR, that there's a lot of gaps, and they're willing to continue engaging in civil disobedience to meet the needs of patients, as they always have.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Hello. Oh, I think we're back. Everyone, we're okay now? All right. Mark, responding to that, I'm curious about how the LPs, either through your own or through the association, how they're planning on filling, if you will, the void of services that these clubs have provided. So overcoming the lack of a face-to-face interaction with the patients, overcoming the lack of a storefront, and also if the LPs are planning to help with the sort of consulting and education services that the clubs and dispensaries historically have provided.
So my source of knowledge and commitment to the community and compassion clubs comes from working with Alan Young, and Alan's obviously a very big advocate of the clubs, and told me from the time that I met him that the social element, that the contribution that the clubs make is significant. So as we built our model, we certainly were very conscious of how we can communicate and educate. And I was very lucky to, before we were all in on being commercial, I spent time in Israel, and there's a provider there, Tikkun Olam, that has an extraordinarily compassionate approach, but the compassion is really heavily intertwined with education and having a different compassion club, one that is onboarding education. It brings in family. It was really a spectacular event. So while we have real limitations, what we're legally allowed to do, from Peace Naturals, absolutely, it's a criteria that's near and dear to us, but from an industry association, we all recognize the relevance and the importance of this. None of us in the industry association see any competition with the clubs. The clubs are very important. They've served a great purpose. They've contributed to having an excellent industry within Canada, and quite honestly, a normalization of cannabis. So we have our direct limitations. We have to be compliant. We want to go out and educate, we want to do way more, but there are a lot of limitations, so it really is a function of us working within regulation, having things like client care teams, and having a process that we can get as intimate as we possibly can, but we have to manage our limitations, and we aspire to be able to provide the level of care and compassion and commitment that the compassion clubs have, but we won't compromise the regulation to do so.
Just following up on what Mark said, so you have to understand that under the MMPR, the only way that the licensed producer can get it to the patient is essentially shipping it, bonded courier, things like that. And so you have to say to yourself, how come? Why aren't the dispensaries and the compassion clubs and the retail stores there? So I think the problem is the provinces haven't stepped up to the plate, and the feds haven't talked to the provinces about it, because normally the provinces would deal with the retail dispensary end of things. So, at the moment, it's still criminal law. That's what covers cannabis, Schedule 2 to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, and so the feds control. Hopefully that'll change within a few years, and it'll be out of the criminal law, and then it's going to be interesting where it falls. But the feds obviously will stay involved as far as Food and Drug Act regulation of natural health care products, import, export, any international stuff. But normally property and civil rights in the province would cover the province's constitutional jurisdiction to deal with things in much the same way as, say, alcohol or tobacco in terms of the retail level. So that's what's missing, is getting the provinces into this scenario in order to round it out and complete it, so that we have a full legalization. Now, of course, I'm talking legalization. Before that, it's clear the feds will continue to control, including medical, because it's an exception to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, it being in that schedule. So hopefully time will progress, and the licensed producers will be able to supply dispensaries, clubs, retail stores, and the market will normalize. That's what hopefully will occur. So I'll save my political speech for tomorrow's wind-up. We can get into it now.
That's fine. We've been running long. That's right. Thank you, John. I'd like to change gears just for a second. We have a very good colleague of ours out in Alberta who's been having huge issues accessing medical services because she uses medical cannabis. So because of the fact that she has to vaporize pretty much consistently through the day, she's had a lot of issues in terms of getting into hospitals and getting the other medical treatments that she needed. As this issue has come up, the folks at NORML have gotten a lot of questions and concerns from people who've had similar issues getting the access to traditional medicine that they need because of the fact that they choose or have to use cannabis. I know that when I helped Paul Lewin work on the Myrna case, the stories that these patients had about trying to get cannabis and just the cold shoulder, to say the least, they were getting from their general doctors or from emergency room doctors was just astounding. So what I want to put out very quickly, we'll start with Mr. Conroy, is if you are a patient who has been able to get access to medical cannabis either through a doctor's form for the MMAR or the MMPR or through a club or through however you have to get your access, and you're facing discrimination through your traditional healthcare providers, what can somebody do to make sure they get the medical treatment that they require? Or to help with that?
Well, currently, it has to be medically approved, so you have to see a doctor. So there is this gatekeeper problem. Ideally, naturopaths and doctors of traditional Chinese medicine and others who know something about herbal medicine would be the appropriate gatekeepers, as opposed to those who keep saying we know nothing because they're used to just having a pill and a blue book that tells them what the dosage and side effects are, and come back in 2 weeks or a month and we'll see about the change in the dose. And so that's the way these doctors think, and it's very upsetting to keep hearing we know nothing about it. Paul Armentano from NORML USA, and I should identify Keith Stroop is here from NORML USA. Paul has done some great stuff which shows all the studies that have been done, including double-blind placebo-based studies in relation to cannabis. There's more information out there about cannabis than any other drug. The cohorts were bigger than other studies, etc. So it's problematic if you don't have a doctor that's going to approve you. Some clinics have started across the country. There's not very many of them that have a doctor attached to the clinic. You can do Skype consultations with some of them. There's still issues that arise between the various colleges, and this is a problem, and I should have mentioned it when I talked about the provincial issue. Colleges of physicians and surgeons are controlled by the provinces, as are lawyers and other professionals. Hospitals, things like that are controlled by the provinces. So, and we've got this major problem here in Ontario and Alberta and a couple of other provinces. The colleges have suddenly taken a tough position and are scaring off the doctors more than ever before and telling them they'll get in trouble if they participate in the program. So a real need out there to educate the doctors, to provide them with this information so they see that there is a lot of information out there. I mean, it's really outrageous, in my opinion, for the medical profession, and it's not the doctors themselves so much, it's their colleges, to be saying we know nothing when there are studies out there, double-blind, placebo-based studies, FDA approved in the US, that talk about significant retarding of tumor growth in cancer, multiple sclerosis, things like that. Surely doctors should be eagerly trying to find out about all of that in order to try and help their patients, and not throwing up their hands and saying, we know nothing, it's the sort of thing that the police do to me when I go to Seattle Hempfest. But, so, I mean, it's a problem. How do we make sure, so hopefully these clinics, there's problems with the colleges about doing these Skype consultations interprovincially if you're not a doctor in this province where the patient is, and these sorts of things. So there's all these issues that have to be sorted out in order to try and ensure the access, and it's a problem, a continuing problem. And so just very quickly, right now you either go to your doctor and get a medical document that you can redeem effectively at a licensed producer, and the label on the package is what shows you're lawfully in possession, as opposed to the authorization to possess. In the early days, you used to get a card for that, now the pink form. So they've technically disappeared as a result of the repeal. But there is still Regulation 53, and that's why I mentioned it in the beginning. And the judge mentions it in his ruling. Regulation 53 under the Narcotic Control Act, which is carried forward and is still the law and is the general prescribing power, still exists. And so people who have to get authorization to possess, if your doctor supports you, that is an alternative way of being authorized to be in possession besides the medical document. The government, though, has moved to limit that to dried marijuana in relation to any doctor authorizing marijuana in order to make it consistent. And that limitation is also challenged in our Allard case. So that's sort of what's going on there. I don't know if I've helped you much in terms of where do you go, but it's a constant fight, and getting after the colleges if your doctors won't support you is really the way to go, because they're scared of their colleges.
Mark, from the perspective of the producers or the industry associations, what is the commercial industry planning to do to help patients, either as they have issues with law enforcement? So as John said, you might only have your package to prove you're legal, and certainly people under the MMAR probably, I've had this problem, even with the giant pink paper, it's not always accepted. So what can the industry do to help smooth patients' experiences with law enforcement or with their medical providers?
So very similar to what I said before, it's a function of us commonly understanding what the issues are, and now there's, I think, 3,800 registered, validated MMPR clients in Canada. And so the bottle is not easy, and the label can degrade. A secondary one isn't allowed. So things like a client card is something that we've tried and we've shared with other CMCIA members that gives an emergency hotline. This doesn't manage the law, because what MMPR says is you need to carry your bottle and your label. Having said that, with your name and number on here, an 800 number, if law enforcement calls, we as an organization that's licensed can validate, yes, that person can have this much. And as we see how this works, then we can roll it out, go to the regulators saying this is a better option. But until we find out collaboratively, we don't know. It's a brand new industry, and there will be multiple different LPs that will have different varying ideas, but ultimately having the common goal of making this much easier for Canadians to possess and walk with their cannabis as they need.
Rielle, similar question for you, but from the perspectives of the clubs and dispensaries. What have the clubs been doing or plan to do to assist their clients interacting with law enforcement or interacting with their healthcare professionals?
Well, I mean, the dispensaries, is this on? Yeah. The dispensaries have been around for a long time, and that's what they've been dealing with since day one. And a lot of the processes that they have in place are to address that. So, you know, the same issues came up, even though it was an illegal industry, it was the same issue. So they have been providing cards, membership cards, and they've worked with their police, the local law enforcement, to recognize those cards. So that's important, and we've been giving that advice to Health Canada to have in the regulations. So, you know, a lot of what's been done can be mimicked, and we'd like to see that, because the whole thing about the Compassion Clubs was creating the model for cannabis distribution for patients. So I think that it would be great for the new industry, the new legal industry, to take what's been done and mimic it as much as possible. And in terms of healthcare providers, that's been a huge problem. We've seen that in our studies as well, and so, you know, some of our more qualitative studies have just, you know, really honed in on that, and just the patient experiences of being stigmatized and regarded as drug seeking by their healthcare professionals and as potheads. But dispensaries, some of the things that they've done in a practical sense have been creating forms that healthcare practitioners were more willing to fill out, that met the needs of healthcare professionals. So they, instead of having, you know, like the MMAR forms, there are forms that gave the basic information and could attest to the medical condition that the patient had, and recommended use, or say why they didn't recommend use, was something that doctors felt more comfortable doing. What we found is more doctors were filling out the forms for dispensaries than they were for Health Canada's program. They felt more comfortable doing that. Education is a huge important thing, and one of the things that I see as really positive in the new legal industry is that there is more incentive from these private profit-seeking corporations to do that kind of education, because that's their gatekeepers to their, you know, for their profits. It's a win-win kind of situation, because patients need that and they have the incentive to do that. So I see that there's going to be, I mean, right, today I was talking to a gentleman who's working for one of the LPs who used to work for as a pharmaceutical rep. So they're putting the money into it. These new LPs are putting their money behind educating doctors, going door to door in the way that doctors are used to being spoken to and are used to getting their information. And I really like that, because doctors need to get this from all places especially that they're comfortable hearing the information from. So I see this as a positive for patients overall.
So before we open the floor to questions, while I have the three of you, I'd just like to hear in 1 minute or less, very briefly, in let's say 5 years time or down the road, when the legal challenges have had some time to shake out, hopefully we don't get the cynical response from government we've gotten in the past, and as the commercial industry has had some time to go through its growing period, if you will, to get out the growing pains, I just would like to know from each of you what you see for the future of the medical marijuana industry in terms of how a patient is going to get access and what sort of access they're going to have. Just sort of your very brief look into the crystal ball. And Mark, I'll start with you for that.
From an LP perspective, those of us in the CMCI see a great evolution, and that will come through research. So as we can get to professional manufacturing, having a standardized plant that's a repeatable procedure, and having an extract method that hopefully is completely solventless, then science is going to listen more. Then the researchers will be likely more involved, and we can help facilitate a better understanding, and quite honestly, hopefully ailment-specific derivatives. So whether it be CBD or THC or whichever the metabolites are going to work for you, we don't believe that the research, the universities, industry that's going to support the funding of this is going to do it based on the past. We believe we have to bring a new dimension of infrastructure, of perfection in manufacturing and standardization for them to take this to the next level, where we can have those very specific, isolated, ailment-specific opportunities where I think the general Canadian population will be more accepting, and then much greater access will be a natural result of that work.
Rielle, same question. Rielle, same question for you, please.
Okay, so 5 years, this is what we're working towards. So I don't know if it'll happen, but this is the aim, is we'll see patients being able to grow their own cannabis, and there might be some electrical inspections that are necessary. We'll have distribution centers, compassion clubs, as well as licensed producers, so the production can be separate from the distribution. So there'll be many options for patients in terms of how they can access cannabis. The cost of cannabis I don't know if 5 years is pushing it, but that's something we really have to be working hard towards, will be covered under drug benefit plans, both private and provincial. We will have patients being able to access legally extracts and edibles, as well as variety of strains and any other great new innovations that come up. We'll have nurse practitioners on board and physicians much more educated, and patients won't have to go to special doctors who charge extra to get their documentation. They'll be able to talk to their regular doctor who won't have any extra charges for the patients. And research will be flourishing, which will lead to greater acceptance and understanding of the plant and how to use it, and a lot more suffering will be alleviated.
Thank you. And John, same question for you as well.
Well, I was going to say this tomorrow, but I just can't hold back when you ask me a question like that. So, I agree with Alan. We are at a unique time in our history. Those of us who've been around a long time remember, and I mean the long history even before we were around, how there was this role of the U.S. states, state by state, starting in Utah, across the U.S., towards prohibition. It wasn't the feds who suddenly imposed it. It was state by state. And then Canada kicked in 1923. The U.S. federally didn't kick in until 1937. So what's going on now? Washington State, Colorado. Keith Stroop tells me Oregon and Alaska are on the verge. We've got 22 medical states in the U.S. More happening all the time. They don't need BC Bud anymore. They've got all their own. I mean, they used to grow most of their own for themselves anyway, but lots of it came from Mexico. They used to have this specialty product from BC that was grown in Newfoundland as long as you called it BC Bud, right? And it supplied 5% of the U.S. market, even though it was 80% of ours. Well, the police tell me people are going out of business left, right, and center in British Columbia. I don't have any grow-up cases lined up the way I used to have. People are going out of business. They're shutting down because they can't get rid of the product, so that the oversupply, including excess production by medical patients, has resulted in this glut on the market where, public safety, why want to rip off a grow, especially a medical grow, if you can't get rid of the product, So things are changing in a big way. And so my prediction is that as long as everybody gets out to vote and votes against the Conservative government, we don't want this police traffic ticket stuff, That's even worse in terms of your civil liberties. Get out and vote strategically to make sure that the party that's going to legalize gets in. And then, within a few years, we will have legal marijuana. As I said earlier, medicine will be covered under natural health care products. If you're going to sell something to the public and call it medicine, doesn't matter what it is, it's going to be regulated by Food and Drug. And you're going to have to comply with those regulations, and that's probably what the LPs will be faced with. Hopefully the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act will no longer play a part in this entire industry. And so What happens in terms of recreation? Well, we'll discuss that on another panel probably. But in terms of medical, I hope that we will see doctors no longer restrained by their colleges, educating and being educated by each other. You could prescribe heroin as long as the patient is an inpatient or an outpatient of a hospital. You can prescribe methadone as long as you've taken the methadone course. Where's the cannabis course? You know? Come on, it's way overdue in terms of, you know, the U.S. government was restraining people from even being able to do research by not allowing them to grow marijuana. So the time has changed. We're on a roll the other way. History cannot be denied, as we say. I used to be, in fact, my favorite expression up until fairly recently was, there is no one more furiously cynical than an idealist betrayed. And that's because I came out of that period in the 70s when we were all idealists and we thought it was going to happen. And I think 3 or 4 times we thought it was going to happen, and it didn't. This time, it's got to happen, and I'm counting on you to make it happen. Thank you very much.